Well, hello students and welcome to an overview of the readings for week 8 for LW305, current developments in Pacific law. What I'm going to do is take you first to the topic guide, which isn't on the list of readings, and then I'm going to go through each of the readings, and we're not going to go through them all line by line. I'm going to take you to key parts that I've highlighted. I encourage you to read them all in your own time, but I also encourage you to draw your focus to the bits that I've highlighted. Try to understand them and read around them yourselves. And maybe something I say about them when I take your attention to them also helps to communicate whatever it is that I'm trying to communicate to you by assigning these readings. So without further ado, let's go first to the topic guide. Okay, so we're currently here at the topic 8, Strengthening Law Macro Approaches Guide. And you're going to read this yourself, I'm sure. So let me just go to a few key points. In this course, for your individual analysis of a plan assessment, I'm asking you to use the Guy Powell's Minimum Standards Framework as a theoretical framework for analysing your law. We talked about that in the week 7 lecture, and we talked about it quite a bit in the overview that I gave you of my expectations for your individual analysis of a law plan, and we might touch on them a little bit more as we go on. Basically, you don't need a theoretical framework, but if you don't have one, the best you'll have is some sort of critical analysis. That's okay if you're good at that. It's hard to be very good at critical analysis, and it takes a long time and a lot of feedback to get better. So sometimes it's helpful to borrow ideas that give us clear structure around the way we're going to talk about an issue. In your topic guide here, there's a little bit of information about how the next few weeks of the course fit in with your analysis of a law paper. And it's likely that when you apply the Powell's Minimum Standards Framework to look at the problems you've identified with a given law and to explain them in that context, you're going to start to develop ideas about strategies for addressing those problems. You're probably going to identify a lot of weaknesses. Maybe they're all part of the same sort of issue of, say, legitimacy or lack of understanding, but you are going to have to focus more on one or two or three key strategies. In the study tasks and questions for you this week, I'm trying to get you to think a lot about how lawyers actually do law reform. What's the actual process? And what study task 1 asks you to do is go to reading 1 in this book, which is here. I think it's got it listed there as well, anyway, that's fine. It's got it as reading 7.1. It should be 8.1. And it wants you to read a very short thing from Anita Jowett and consider these review questions. So what do practicing lawyers think about what a law should be? Do they think about it from a social or political perspective? Where do lawyers looking to change law acquire knowledge about society or politics? Did judges think about it? How do judges reach decisions? How do law reform commissions come up with ideas about how the law should be when they receive all of these submissions, these competing submissions from NGOs? And what about policy analysts, policy staff in government offices who make recommendations and drafting instructions for new laws? Well, the reading says that when lawyers do law reform, that's sort of a bit intuitive. We kind of have ideas about what isn't working, and we see it or we hear about it or there's evidence. And so that points us in directions of things that we think might work. But that could be based and influenced by our own biases, our own preferences, etc. Hopefully we apply some sort of critical analysis, we question our sources, we check our references and so on. And again, we say that lawyers maybe aren't necessarily the best equipped people in society for doing some of these things, some say. At the very least, we need multidisciplinary approaches. Okay. If I take you down to that reading, it's quite short and I will leave you to read it. But I'm going to take you to the conclusion. The article argues that lawyers who are trained solely in law, to all of you, do not have the disciplinary training to be able to undertake systematic process-based law reform on their own. Instead, legal training gives rise to a somewhat ad hoc approach that is hopefully based upon critical analysis. Ad hoc is haphazard. We just made it up as we went along. To develop a more process-driven approach to law reform, multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary approaches to examine the operation of law in society and the likely impacts of various law reform options on society are needed. So you might recommend higher mandatory penalties for offenders of all crimes, so anyone who commits a burglary. But what if inflation is so high and unemployment is so high that there's lots of very poor people stealing food just so that they can eat or feed their families? Well, now you've essentially you've created laws which unfairly punish the poor. Rich people can just spend more money for their bread or whatever. Poor people are the ones who suffer the most. So if you take this squarely from a justice perspective, you might say, oh, well, that's what the law says, bad luck. And if you take it from a different perspective, say an ethics of care or something, you might find that what you think the right outcome is changes. And so that's what happens when we apply different lenses. That's what happens when we move from the black letter of the law to, I guess, deciding the grey that law deals with. And there are many shades of grey. All right. Also here, there's a fun little option for how you might use your intuitive approach. Feel free to do the study task. Feel free to not. And we come here to this. So big picture, what we're talking about this week, our strengthening law. We're thinking about legitimacy of the law, what makes law legitimate, and what makes it legitimate that we are all subject to law and not to men, as it were. So these are readings you've been given. Hassel talks about rational authority and says we should have communicative action. Now, communicative action was developed by another scholar, famous philosopher called Habermas, and there's a reference that you can download, a very long paper, worth reading, but you've got the summary here. Basically, he contrasts what communicative action is. He explains what it is by contrasting it with instrumental and strategic action. Right, so instrumental and strategic action are oriented to successful action in a situation, and communicative action is a strategy for reaching understanding between different parties. And you can have a look a bit more about what the detail of it is, and we'll talk about it a little bit in the lecture as well. By contrast, traditional authority, so we've got rational authority, we've got traditional authority. In topic 7, we talked a lot about custom and traditional authority. And we obviously are aware that there's many ways traditional authority and state law interact in our societies. Many ways. And then we have charismatic authority. And we've got some examples from Frozen here being used to sell yogurt and goodness knows what else. So again, this is, forget this little reference there. So 3 kinds of authority, different ways of trying to bring about change, and the tools that we are trying to develop. So we're talking this week in the lecture about developing a toolkit for law reform. And we can see that our tools for law reform are our intuition. We can see that building communicative action, where we foster understanding rather than simply try to influence a situation. We need to sort of develop a deeper understanding about different parties' motivations, interests, etc. We'll touch more on that in the readings. And we can see that these other forms of authority, religion and custom and ideas of hierarchy, can be used to strengthen rational authority, such as law. And rational authorities can also, we'll touch on some ideas about rational authority in the Braithwaite reading. So without further ado, I think that's all I want to cover. Reading 2 you can look at in your own time as well. This is just another example of a student applying the PALS minimum standards framework. It's not an example of how you should prepare your plan or use this in your final analysis of a law, but it might be a good brainstorming exercise. Okay, so our first reading that we're going to go through is the reading by Zern. And so here it is. I'm already here on page 62. You'll note that this is a theory of global governance. It's a big book. It's a free book for you, it seems. And there's an awful lot of dense parts of this book and of this reading. So hopefully going through a few little bits that I've highlighted will help cut through it a bit for you. So let me quickly run through this. So, liberal reasoning. Google it if you're struggling with some of the key terms. We're going to keep the pace. Liberal reasoning agrees that limitations on autonomy for individuals through rules requires justifications. Okay? The liberalism, the difference between communal societies versus individual liberal societies. What do you value? The group, the individual, capitalist, socialist, etc. This is basically saying in an individual-focused society, rules require justification. Maybe that's the case in more socialist societies as well. Anyway, rules require justification. What the essence of this chapter is arguing is that the rise of international and transnational sources of authority, or international organizations and so on, the UN, international bar associations, all of them, has changed world politics in empirical terms. We can measure it. And it's brought about issues of legitimacy and normativity. So legitimacy, some would say the authority of something, or the right of something, to the perception that something is valid, and issues of normativity. Well, what should you do or should you not do? Okay, in this chapter, it discusses legitimation strategies in global governance, okay? So things which legitimize actions by usually governments. Its main argument is that globally these systems are precarious. It says there's two problems. There's a bias towards measurement and control of things. So measuring efficiency would be a good example. We can measure how effective this dollar is going to be, therefore we can justify using it in a certain way and we can account for it. And then the other problem for legitimacy is the lack of impartiality in the exercise of authority. And this is where we might be talking about things like corruption and bias and so on. So within development, within governing our societies, we have problems with the legitimacy of law, and these problems exist because sometimes we're so focused on accountability and measuring things, and sometimes these systems are disrupted by impartial, corrupt, self-serving actors who might themselves have other pressures, and the reason for their corruption might be good reasons, but nevertheless they're not playing by the rules that we expect everyone to follow, but then nobody really does. Anyway, it's complex. In general, the exercise of public authority, state authority, requires legitimation, and it says this is a social process. So it's not like just because you've got the big hat and you're the minister of everything that what you do is legitimate. This is a co-developed idea. I'm not legitimate until the people I say that I'm subject over or whatever recognize me as being legitimate. I can stand there on my pulpit and say whatever I want day in, day out, but if there's nobody in the pews, nobody coming to listen, whatever I say might as well isn't legitimate for the flock that I'm preaching to or trying to. They're over there listening to somebody else, hopefully with a better collar than mine. The article distinguishes between beliefs in legitimacy and processes of legitimacy. And I'll let you sort of read through that yourself. We get a definition of legitimacy. And again, you're talking about in your assessments, you're going to be analyzing a law. A key question for all laws in the Pacific has to do with their legitimacy. In the context of decolonization of laws, in the context of, questionable authority of governments to act, non-constitutional decisions and bills by enactments as well in many countries. So legitimacy is a pretty significant issue and current development in Pacific law. Here, we're trying to talk about, well, who's involved in this legitimizing process of, say, laws and rules. And you've just developed policy papers, position papers for your first assignment as NGOs. So all of those NGOs, all the government organizations, all the other individuals making submissions, everybody that missed out and didn't get their submission in, these are all groups that are trying to regulate or influence or control an issue. Fishing, what women can do with their bodies, the gender of people that can get married, and well, not just gender of people that can get married, the orientations of people that get married, and so on. So all of these groups and people are part of this process of legitimation of laws and rules in society. And there's also processes of delegitimation, right? For every person advocating for reforms for marriage equality, there are some fairly conservative people arguing against those rights. So trying to delegitimize, legitimize, etc. Legitimize existing laws, delegitimize potential laws, and so on. And when we can, I don't want to run through this too quickly, but I also don't want to go into too much detail with you. You can see there's a few bits that are highlighted, and you can pause it at any time and follow along. So I won't talk about everything. Importantly though, coming to this difference between belief and process, a given power relationship, I have power, you don't have power, isn't legitimate because people believe it's legitimate, but because the structure that exists, that power relationship, can be justified in terms of my beliefs. So the only way I can easily exemplify that, or give you a good, an example of that, is you're religious, you go to church, there's a priest at the church. This is saying that, and in that, there's a power imbalance, right? They're the man of God. You give them respect. You go up, eat your cracker and eat your, drink your wine and pray and do those things. And occasionally you talk to the priest and you sort of feel, we chatted, or your pastor gives you good instruction or whatever. Or maybe they come to your house all the time, or maybe your parents the pastor. I don't know. But within that group, the authority of that individual, what this is saying, isn't because we believe that person has more power necessarily, or is more connected to God, or has a better understanding of scripture, or whatever it is, but because in our belief system that we all agree on and that we've all established amongst us, there is a person who is at the front, who is called a priest, who wears that gear, who says the things, and is holier, and is all of those things. And so the fact that there is somebody there like that makes complete sense in terms of my beliefs and the systems of beliefs I've grown up with. And we can apply the same thing to traditional structures in villages. We can apply the same thing to my childhood growing up in Australia, and the structures and the schools and the environments that I'm used to. We can say the same thing about anyone in any place or group. People in football teams. It makes sense that, we I don't want to get too abstract or too far away from a good example, but that there is a certain hierarchy within a football club makes sense to us if we're part of a football club or we've come to football clubs because we've just our beliefs about how football clubs work are shaped from our participation in them, and it makes sense then. So it's just a bit of a nuanced point, right? It's sort of saying it's not the fact that you believe, but because what is in front of you fits into your beliefs. If it didn't fit into your beliefs, you wouldn't feel it was legitimate, right? And it's not that you believe it's illegitimate, it's just that it doesn't fit in with what you believe is, we'll move on. Creating authority, creating this legitimacy is important to any source of authority, right? Whether it's custom, whether it's religion, whether it's the law. And one of the ways this occurs is through legitimation narratives, okay? And so in practice, it says here, different sources of legitimacy are crafted together in a narrative that binds authority back to the impartial pursuit of whatever the social purpose is. So we're trying to regulate fishing, that's our social purpose, and there's a lot of big fishing companies and other vested interests involved in that, and then there's government actors, and then there's environmental actors, and everyone's fighting for control of the legitimating narrative. And there's many challenges to that narrative. We might see this narrative in the media, who controls the media. And different narratives are constructed, they rise, they fall, and this is what's being argued in this article in one sense is that these competing narratives are picked up by different groups and used in different ways to try to control policy or to how we regulate or how we manage our societies. One narrative is the participatory narrative, equal opportunity. It often relies on things like accountability, and it's a means of control. It doesn't mean it's bad, but equal opportunity. We control those who have unequal opportunity. And we have the legal narrative. So you're most familiar with this, that legitimacy is based on protecting rights and the rule of law. So whenever there's a problem in society, the rule of law says the authority of the law applies to all people equally, not in a participatory way, but that the law is supreme. It also requires certainty and predictability, which is sometimes problematic in society because a lot of our problems are complex and the answers uncertain, and the ways that things are influenced and changed over time is also complex and uncertain. How can we regulate in complexity? In this narrative, courts and judges must be freed from mechanisms of accountability in order to decide autonomously and impartially. This reflects the general idea that it's the independence and autonomy of the legal system that grants it legitimacy. Independence and autonomy is the source of legitimacy of the legal system. That's the idea of this narrative. And obviously when the independence and the autonomy of the judiciary is under threat, as it has been in Fiji, as it has been in Kiribati in recent times, that can have a delegitimizing effect. And when a government starts to delegitimize its own legal system, that starts to undermine the rule of law. So if you believe in a legal narrative perspective. Perhaps you combine it with other perspectives, but if you're still adopting this idea that the rule of law is a good thing, then sometimes, you have to listen to this narrative in whatever your issue is. Environmental law, domestic violence law, whatever. But we also have to think about fairness. And this shifts focus from procedures to the outcomes, right? Well, okay, we've got to have a fair process, but what about a fair outcome? You know, what should everybody get life in prison? Should everybody, what if it was an accident? Should there be any defenses to criminal laws and so on? What's fair? There's the technocratic narrative that authorities derive support from the quality of their output. And I don't want to get into that. This is central in modernity, right? Where we can measure things, we know, we've got science, and, we know that there's expertise, we rely on expertise, we pay the accountant, we pay the lawyer, we pay the construction engineer, we pay the fisherman, etc. The traditional narrative, and we hear this a lot too, what's our habit? What are our beliefs? What did we used to do? Something that's worked for a long time is good. And since whatever we're dealing with, social sciences, social problems are very complex, it's unlikely a single improvement can, be produced without causing a range of other side effects that undermine the system. Well, maybe. That's a very conservative and traditional approach. Maybe change is good. And then there's other narratives, and I'm not going to get into all of them, but all of them involve some sort of, there's the way these different NGOs and interests and ideas all kind of compete, involves different narratives in different amounts. We hear about fake news, for example, So this gets quite detailed. I think that's probably the most I want to say about, draw out from this. Please read the rest of it if you'd like. It's confusing to me in parts, so I'm sure it's confusing to you in parts. A successful legitimation narrative must nurture the belief that the authority serves the social purpose and provides for the common good in an impartial way. If your authority, say a government, is favouring grants to one particular province because that's where the Prime Minister's from, then, it might be for good reasons. They need roads, they need schools, they need hospitals, but it's not seen to be impartial. That starts to delegitimize, well, the actions of government. And so again, this is this sort of mutually creating idea of legitimacy. The problem, this is a good quote for you, the problem of unbalanced power is not that unchecked power will lead inevitably to tanks rolling across borders. It is rather that radically unbalanced power will undermine the procedural rules on which stable and sustained cooperation must inevitably depend. So we must balance power is the overall message there. Okay, we're going to move on next to the reading by Yuan Ong, that is, How China Escaped the Poverty Trap. Topical country, topical issue, and I think a very important book for anybody to read. And let's see what we can squeeze out of this introduction, shall we? So the chapter, indeed the book, starts with a great little quote, or a parable really. A pauper who turns to two finance gurus for advice. The pauper is broke, poorly educated, and lives in a rough neighborhood. The first guru says, earn your first paycheck. Once you make money, your circumstances will improve, and you'll eventually escape poverty. Go and earn. The second guru says, start by doing as my rich clients do. Go to college or university. Move to a safe town, maybe not Suva, and buy health insurance. You can only escape poverty by first creating all the prerequisites for wealth. So you need to be well educated, you need to live in a good place, and you need to be healthy. But of course, the advice from both gurus falls short. The first guru provides no clue as to how to earn your first paycheck, and the second guru ignores the reality of poverty. So this is the place that China found itself in many years ago, and this is the place of most developing countries, is the analogy, I guess. I'm going to take you through a few highlighted points from throughout this, and what I want you to put at the front of your mind is, we're talking about strengthening law, we're talking about current developments in law, we're talking about the process in Pacific countries of decolonizing laws and developing new laws. We're talking about developing new regulations and approaches for fixing social problems in our societies, of lack of employment, of domestic violence, of questionable government policies regarding elections, of questionable government decisions regarding registration of people's names, regarding all sorts of different issues, environmental protection, logging, you name it. And in that context, we have to think about, the places that we're dealing with, the constraints and limitations that we have, the development context. And there's certain things that are kind of relevant to know. Not all foreign aid is good. There's good evidence. Go to the references. In some places, foreign aid has worsened corruption and brought more harm to the poor. Money seems to, big sums of money for construction projects that filter their ways into the pockets of the wealthy elite somehow. And yet this aid for trade narrative is the dominant narrative that's fueling investment in development from prosperous countries. Well, that's one thing to think about. Another thing to think about is we think about strong institutions, weak bureaucracies, and we need strong ones. Weak regulation, but we need strong ones. Well, this actually maybe isn't the right approach. Indeed, as this paper argues, actually the way China escaped its poverty track is by building markets with weak institutions, that the strength comes from weak institutions. And that's useful because we've got a lot of weak institutions. And so it's handy that we don't need strong ones in order to escape the poverty trap. And, you escape the poverty trap, it means there's government money for education, health, healthcare, social welfare, and infrastructure and all the other things we want. So this idea that we can harness weak institutions is important. Normally we think, let's make strong institutions somehow that mimic Australian, New Zealand, American institutions, and Chinese institutions, and this book suggests a different path. It's not easy and it's very complex, and I think it's bespoke and unique for each place. And that's why, if we look at the other readings, you need this multidisciplinary approach. It's not just a legal solution, you might have various social solutions. Our past determines our starting point, but that legacy is something that we can shape, perhaps by shaping the narrative and how we talk about it for destructive or constructive purposes, for good or bad, to build or to destroy. What we find in a lot of our governance institutions is that because of the capacity constraints of, say, justice or healthcare in outer islands or education teachers, that there's a lot of improvisation amongst ground level agents. And we can see this, if you study any law that's in operation dealing with any issue, we can see this across all sectors of our society. And this book argues that is good, that this, if what we're trying to do is move from a less developed to a more developed state, that actually what regulators should be doing, if that's government or an institution or body that regulates that area, financial regulations, reserve banks, tax, whatever, fishing, that encouraging that improvisation is a good thing, because this is how we develop unique ways of addressing the problems that we're actually facing on the ground. Pretty cool. Not a fast problem, not a throw the money at it and just the problem goes away somehow fix, but a practical solution. So maybe look at this quote in context. Obviously, China's got 1 billion people. That helps, really helps to have, at one point in time, a sixth or more of the world's people as a labor force. That's going to give you a head start for growth. But as the analogy says here, to conclude that sort of capital and labor are like eggs, sugar and flour, and if you throw them into a bowl and leave it overnight, that'll turn into a cake, isn't how a cake works, and isn't how growing an economy works. Ong Yuan Yuan talks about this idea of complexity. And, here we're talking about frameworks and tools when we're talking about conceptual frameworks in the last few weeks. And it says, well, actually these tools of social science, these frameworks that we're talking about, are really useful for some questions when, we're studying problems that, only have one cause or one or two causes that we can carefully study. But when we're dealing with complex social situations where any action in a given situation might be because of my religious beliefs or my customary obligations or duties or some legal reason or any one of another of 100 other factors, it can be very hard to understand what's happening in that interaction using other existing social tools. And so she proposes this approach through complexity and complexity theory as a paradigm. And we're not going to go into that in much detail, but it'll be familiar to you in other ideas of, say, relationships, right? The idea that in society, different people and places and things and ideas are connected by their relationships with one another. And They all influence each other at the same time, and it's all a bit unpredictable. We can study it and understand the systems better, but still, it's all a bit unpredictable. Like predicting where an electron's going to be in a molecular structure. And here she highlights the difference between an idea of a complicated world and complex systems. So political economies, politics, society, means of production. There's many players, companies, individuals, politicians, NGOs, many institutions, and the way they interact to control narratives and to shape society and to govern and to regulate are complex. And they've all got different interests and hidden interests. It says here, the ability to collect and pin on a board all of the insects that live in the garden does little to lend insight into the ecosystem, right? So we need to study the relationships between things to understand them, which is a pretty important point. Which is why a simple comparative law approach is good, but it's only one piece of what we need to do. She arrives at a three-step formula. Harness weak institutions to build markets, emerging markets stimulate strong institutions, and then strong institutions preserve markets, right? So she doesn't say that we don't need strong institutions. She says we do. It's just that if you're trying to grow markets, you need those weak institutions to build those conditions for growth. And not in a bad way, but, I guess the argument here is that, sometimes you need to poison a few rivers to, build a few hospitals. At an extreme end, maybe we can do it without poisoning the rivers as China did. But at least they built a lot of hospitals and schools and residential towers that they're knocking down and all of that. And she says, look, not only is this relevant, not only does what I've discussed explain China, but it also explains medieval Europe. It explains the growth of the United States and other examples like Nollywood. It's an offshoot of Bollywood and Hollywood in Nigeria. So she says, this is sound thinking, right? So even though it seems wacky to say you need weak institutions, but that's a good thing, and that you need to leverage this for growth, and then they can become she says this is robust, and this has become a pretty important book. This idea of adaptation, she says, is important. And what are the conditions that enable that adaptive process of co-evolution? And do those conditions result from external forces, or can you create them internally? Right? Do we need bald white guys flying over to be judges in the Pacific? Or do we have enough local lawyers we can promote to the upper echelons of the judiciary now? People we can trust to be impartial. We're probably pretty close in a lot of places, maybe not in others. So this idea of adaptation and this need for adaptation, it's complicated. It's complex, but it's worth considering what are some of the barriers to adaptation and what we can do about them. And in this book, Ang Yuanyuan argues that there's different ways obstacles regarding adaptation manifest. There's variation, and that central reformers, so governments, want local agents to flexibly implement central mandates according to whatever the local conditions are. So whatever's going on in that outer island, go and do the health service thing, go and do the education thing, go and build the road, or the bridge, whatever. How agents adapt to particular situations is shaped by their criteria of success. What does success look like to you? Okay, so how do we select? When we're adapting, how do we select what is successful and what works? And how do we select bureaucrats that are doing the right thing? And then niche creation is this other idea. So we've got diversity across different islands, places, countries, and so we've got different ways of solving similar problems in different places. And then sometimes the solution from over there that we've developed locally might actually work over here as well, or a variation of it. And so this idea that we can have lots of experiments going all over the place, and we can support and fund those with small amounts of money because they're local and they're small scale, but then we can select the promising ones and try to sample those or test them in more places. This is how we maybe lead towards more rapid development of good ideas. And this is her argument in brief. Instead of aspiring to copy the exact actions of others, what is needed are the conditions that spur productive and sustained searches for solutions that fit different and evolving environments. Because that's what we've got in the Pacific, different and evolving environments. We need an adaptive bottom-up search within states for localized solutions, right? So we need these local solutions to common problems that we can then promote, select, and roll out. And this is what she describes as this co-evolutionary process of radical change. So pretty cool. That's the introduction. You can bet that other parts of the book get very technical, and it's obviously a very pro-China book, and not everyone feels that way about different places, but excellent ideas to learn from. Okay, I'm going to take you over into the reading from Braithwaite now. And here we are. We're right at the end of it. That's convenient. Now, this is a very long reading, and I think there might be other readings on responsive regulation that might be more accessible for you. But this guy invented it, and it's been a pretty popular idea for the last 30 or more years. There's if you Google John Braithwaite or look him up on Google Scholar, you'll see that he's a fairly eminent and highly cited scholar. His idea of responsive regulation, let's see if we can find where I've got a definition for it. A central idea of responsive regulation, I'll start, is this idea of a regulatory pyramid. So you have a pyramid of support and you have a pyramid of sanctions. And so this is then done in relation to medicine. And here we can see that as a regulator, if I want to support people to comply, at the bottom, if people want to comply or they're not resisting me as a regulator, I can educate and persuade. I can praise them. As people get sort of more and more rationally motivated or resistant. So here people are, they believe and they want to comply. Here they sort of need some support or encouragement. So prizes and grants and patents here. And at the top, we've got the Nobel Prize in Medicine for that. But here, if people are not complying, we have an alternative. So we've offered support, but they didn't take it. So now we shame them. Shame is a good motivator of compliance. And we then praise them because they did some good things, but then they did some bad things. So we're escalating sanctions and we're increasing up the pyramid in response to more resistant behavior. We can still provide higher level supports if as a regulator, we observe behavior we want, but we fall back on the sanctions. And so if you read through the article, this idea of responsive regulation is that a regulator responds to the postures or the actions of the regulated. And that could be in fishing boats, that could be transport, that could be people not registering vehicles, that could be taxis, that could be tax compliance, that could be anything, right? All of these social issues, all these problems that we regulate by law, these ideas of responsive regulation are talking about them. And so here we see another example of a regulatory pyramid. At the bottom of the pyramid, we want full voluntary compliance. What's the best thing? If you want people to follow the law, ideally everybody does it willingly and voluntarily. That you can't stop everybody littering. So what you need to do somehow is to make it so that everybody wants to not litter. So how do you do that? Awareness, that's okay. One thing, a lot of you'll talk about awareness, education, counselling, infringements, voluntary undertakings, commitment rings, compliance, enforcement, injunctions, cancelling things, prosecutions. Okay, and on this side, on the left-hand side, we see, what it's responding to. So these are the compliance responses, and these are the attitudes of the people or the organizations that you want to comply. Are they fully compliant? Are they able to comply? Well, what if they're willing but they're not able? So you can support them, you can give them control, you can, whatever. What if they're able to comply but they're not willing to? Well, then you punish them more. And what if they're really disengaged and really doing the wrong thing and bulldozing their way through the reefs and, all of that? Well, then you can prosecute them. So you can read through then some of these key quotes. An important point here. Often business regulators find that they try restorative justice and it fails. Business or tax regulators, they escalate and then it fails. And so all of this deterrence fails. That happens for a number of reasons, and it's come up a few times in the forums and in your papers, is a deterrence trap, where no level of deterrent can make compliance economically rational. For businesses, maybe compliance, if it's just a financial penalty, is just the cost of doing business. For criminals, if you're heavily embroiled in crime or you commit crimes of passion, doesn't matter what the deterrence factor of the law is, it's not going to be effective. So it's a trap to think that deterrence, just because you're put off by going to jail, doesn't mean that somebody else is. So it's a trap, and you get trapped in that thinking. And it causes problems because you make a decision based on that and it doesn't work. And then more people get harmed and you don't know why. Restorative justice is talked about here, and we're trying to focus on the bottom of the pyramid. So there's different images throughout this document that I commend to you. I'm going to go through a lot of this, It's not because it's not important, but it's because you can read it in your own time. Some important points about regulating. Again, you're talking about regulating climate change reforms. You're talking about regulating society. He says that the regulator should focus on change talk. It should be collaborative. That regulatees should voice arguments for change. That regulators should strengthen change talk, offer advice, listen, and responsively act based on the commitment language of the regulated. So we're talking about communicative action, we're talking about engaging, we're talking about creating legitimacy by ensuring that the regulated are part of developing not just what the change is, but why change is needed. And this is how we develop consensus. This is how we build legitimacy and change in social reform, in law reform, in strengthening laws. There's a number of key headings. He talks about Valerie Braithwaite's work on motivational postures. Look at that it's interesting stuff. Praise those who show commitment and nurture motivations to improve. I want you all to feel this way. I want to support your innovation. I want to help the best of you pull up the worst of you through new ceilings of excellence. And this is responsive regulation. So one of the best ways to, I guess, ensure that we improve, we regulate effectively, is for regulators to not worry so much about mixed messages. If an organization's doing the wrong thing in one area, but they do the right thing in another area, the argument from a responsive regulation perspective is that it's not inconsistent to praise the good things they're doing while also sanctioning them for the bad things they're doing. That's not inconsistent. That's just what the rules permit. And if all you're doing is saying, oh, but you're doing this bad thing, you're bad, and you ignore the good, that's just going to build resistance and resentment. Okay, so it needs to be a dialogue, and there needs to be this fluidity and flexibility within the application of the rules and how we apply them. The responsive approach is to resort to holding actors responsible for what they've done in the past only when we can't make them responsible for making things right now and in the future. Okay? What's the point in punishing people for past actions? Let's start by saying, okay, you did bad things. Let's make sure that doesn't happen again. And if we can't do that, well, yeah, we will punish you for what you've done, and we might still punish you for what you've done, but let's focus on what we can change immediately to make the future better. Seems like a pretty good way to approach a problem, because sometimes we feel ashamed of our past actions. And if all people want to talk about is our past actions that are shameful, perhaps we don't want to come to the table and we're resistant. So I think I'm going to leave it there for responsive regulation. I think it's very important that you read at least some of this article and get an idea of what we're talking about. And hopefully I've given you a few little leads into this fairly big and long article. Our final reading is the reading from Miranda Forsyth. And I haven't highlighted much of this. It's a short article. Read the entire thing. Read the entire thing. She is a very, very important scholar for issues around restorative justice, responsive regulation, and sorcery and witchcraft accusations, violence against women and children, and a whole range of issues in law in the Pacific. Her focus is that it's really hardly surprising, given how our laws have developed in positivistic environments and that they are applied in pluralistic societies, that we so often find that our laws don't fix the problems that we have. She makes many good arguments throughout, and and ultimately she argues about the narrative powers of law and of learning in the Pacific, and that it's necessary to understand, if we want to utilize legislation effectively, law reform effectively in the Pacific, we need to understand the context of the place in which it applies. And this means we need a holistic approach. We need to understand that there's different powers that legislation can have, and that these powers overlap in practice. And then we need to understand that law must be activated through communication, through meetings, through communicative action, and through performance for it to have any meaning. We must observe the law operating for it to mean something. We must hear of the law being performed for it to have meaning, especially when, for us, law is steeped in oral traditions. Legitimacy is steeped in oral traditions. Law has a signaling power. Law has jurisdictional power. It claims authority and legitimacy to regulate. Law has an enumerated hybridized power. So law, because we have plural legal systems, constitutional pluralities, law changes custom and custom changes law. Law has a narrative power. It draws from morality. It draws from religious narratives. It draws from different ways of making words on paper become something meaningful to individuals, to us, to people. And all of these sources of legitimacy interact in complex ways in our society. And not only do people, if we want state laws, for example, to be strong, not only do people need knowledge of the law, but people need to practice the law. It needs to become part of what people do, like not littering, like obeying road rules, like other social norms and laws and rules of society, like paying taxes and declaring taxes, etc. So all of those processes don't come about from law reform or making a new law, although that is probably important as part of a communicative, engaged, co-creating, responsive process. And so that's about all I wanted to take you through for the readings for week 8. There's a lot there that I've covered, and there's a lot more that could be covered. Uh, enjoy your, enjoy finishing off your reading, and I'll talk to you next time.